We got about
Okay.
30 people in. Okay, welcome to this webinar sponsored by the Labor Working Group of the Socialist Party USA. We're dealing with passenger rail as a solution to climate change and how to extend that rail system to much broader areas to get more people out of their cars into rail systems so that it'll be a climate solution. We're also going to talk about public ownership of rail. It's a campaign that the Railroad Workers United is going to present, and Ron, our guest Ron Kaminkow, will talk about that. That's a good sign here. Public ownership and democratic control of the means of production has always been a basic principle of the Socialist Party USA and the socialists for a long time. This goes back to the Populist Party in the 1890s. But it's a key of what we see in Socialist Party anyway, and that's a great thing to hear. The Labor Working Group is our work group within the Socialist Party. We deal with labor issues, organizing, policy for the party, getting members engaged on different projects and locally, national campaigns, etc., strike support and education and how to organize, that type of thing. Socialist Party is the party was formed in 1973. We have a lineal heritage going back to the old Socialist Party of America, founded by Debs and others. And whereas some wanted to go into the Democratic Party, that became DSOC and then DSA, others kept an independent Socialist Party going in that tradition. The formation of the party was 1901. Prior to that, it was a Social Democratic Party. Members of the remaining members of the American Railway Union formed that Social Democratic Party after the defeat of the ARU in 1894. So there's a whole history, a whole line of experience that workers had gone through, including Debs, until he declared January 1st, 1997, to be a socialist. He learned from experience. He was not a theoretical person. Sure, the socialists gave him literature and all that. He tried reading it. He learned from experience. So it's a hard road, but he did it, and here we are today. So our themes are going to be on those two topics: passenger rail expansion and public ownership of rail. We're going to have our various panelists speak on each of their areas. First will be Ron Kaminkow. He's an organizer for Railroad Workers United. He has a long history in rail and various aspects of and various unions within railroad. He can give us more information. He has a real passion to get all workers organized into one union, and that's a good thing to hear. He tried getting a federation organized, but that didn't quite go further. And in 2008 he formulated the Railroad Workers United, which is not a union in the classic sense of railroad workers, which are based in craft and their own bargaining contracts, but it's a caucus of unions trying to push all these unions further down the road. Then we have Mary Nickum, who is chair of the Eco-Socialist Working Group of the Socialist Party USA, and also editor of the Socialist, our newsletter. We have Eric Chester, who's a member of the Labor Working Group. We have Wayne Turner, who's a member of North Carolina Greens, and he'll have a lot to say on a history of labor in rail and also the problems involved. So let's start off. Each panel also have about 5 to 7 minutes, although we'll give Ron a little bit more, and we'll start off with Ron introduce himself and the problems with rail and passenger rail, etc. So go ahead, Ron.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Thanks to the Socialist Party for inviting me to be on the panel today. Like Bill says, my name's Ron Kaminkow, a locomotive engineer, just retired a few months ago from Amtrak after 20 years. And I had been a freight railroader prior to that with a railroad called Norfolk Southern, which you all have heard of East Palestine, Ohio fame. And prior to that, I worked for Conrail as a brakeman and a conductor. We got hijacked by the Norfolk Southern in a major corporate takeover in '99. So that's my history on the railroad. I got very interested in the whole question of railroad labor. And I've been in the UTU, which is now the Smart Transportation Division. And then I came over to the BLE when I joined Amtrak, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. And this is the tip of the iceberg in rail. Unfortunately, we have 12 different railroad unions. There was a time when we actually had 26 different unions about 100 years ago. And of course, Bill referenced Eugene V. Debs, who was the big-time leader of the Locomotive Firemen's Union. He went on to help organize other craft unions and quickly realized that this was not actually winning the day. We needed a railroad workers union, and Debs actually was very instrumental in forming the American Railway Union, which was the first industrial union in the United States. Unfortunately, as Bill also referenced, the union was crushed during the Pullman strike in 1894. Sadly, the craft union system was ossified under the Railway Labor Act in 1926. And for the last 100 years, we've had all these different craft unions. They scab on each other, they fight with each other, they refuse to stick together in bargaining. We just saw the debacle that took place in 2022. If you all were paying attention to our National Freight Master Agreement contract fight, we didn't stick together. And if we had, we probably would have had a much more positive outcome. So Railroad Workers United was formed 16, 17 years ago. And we are the living spirit of Eugene V. Debs and this idea of an industrial union for all railroad workers. And the reason I embellish that and put a lot of time into that is because I think it's important for everybody to understand just who the hell we are and what we do. So for the last decade, we have been advocating not just for railroad worker rights and benefits, better wages, working conditions, safety on the job, and everything else. We also believe that the rail industry itself is in fact the worst enemy of the rail industry. Now, get your head around that idea. Some people think that environmentalists are the worst enemy of the rail industry. Other people think it's trucks or planes or barge tows on rivers. The worst enemy of the rail industry is the rail industry itself. It is using the rail industry as a cash cow and extracting huge amounts of profits that then are put into stock buybacks, bonuses, options for CEOs, and dividends for stockholders, much to the detriment of the rail industry. We should be double tracking, electrifying, extending sidings, and otherwise investing in the infrastructure of the railroad industry. For those who are in doubt, I will cite a single statistic. In 2006, we moved 32.1 million carloads of freight. In 2023, we moved 24.4 million carloads of freight. And for those of you who are not math whiz kids, that's a 24% decline. The rail industry is actually gutting the rail industry. So how does this all fit into the subject of the day, expansion of passenger rail? I would postulate that in addition to being the biggest enemy of the freight rail industry, the Class 1, the big railroads that own 90% of the freight industry in this country, over which most Amtrak trains and other passenger trains operate their trains, is the biggest bulwark against expansion of passenger rail. As an Amtrak employee for 20 years, I witnessed firsthand being delayed by freight trains. The latest operating model that the freights are using, called PSR, Precision Scheduled Railroading, is nothing more than a racket for Wall Street to increase super profits, drive down the operating ratio, run 3-mile-long trains, eat up track capacity, and anything that gets in the way, like a scheduled passenger train, be damned. This is the context within which we are trying to expand passenger rail in this country. We have a golden opportunity as the highways get more and more clogged up and crumble, as everyone wants to avoid the airways. Passenger trains are poised to make a huge comeback. For all of his faults, one of the benefits of having Joe Biden is he actually did go to bat for rail passenger expansion. We have $66 billion, an unheard of amount of money to expand the passenger network. The Federal Railroad Administration has asked for feedback and input. I think we have 69 different potential new corridors and routes, frequency expansions. It's really a good day for us. The potential has not been there since Amtrak was originated in 1971, 53 years ago. But there's this elephant in the room called the Class I railroads. They own the tracks in this country. They are an aberration. Nowhere else in the world does private industry actually own the infrastructure of the railroad. Not in China, Japan, Spain, Germany, etc. Even in the United Kingdom, where they privatized the railroads, the infrastructure is still held publicly. We are an aberration in this country. In addition, I would postulate that all transportation infrastructure in this country is publicly owned. The waterways, the airports, the seaports, and mostly the interstate highway system, all owned publicly. What we are asking is not radical. It is not outrageous. But Railroad Workers United, after debating and discussing this issue for over a decade, has come to the conclusion that the only way forward for any real substantive change in the rail industry in this country, which is to say doubling the number of carloads shipped in freight, doubling, tripling, quadrupling the number of passengers moved by passenger trains, we have to take on this question of Wall Street's stranglehold. And don't get me wrong, it is a monopoly. We once had a couple hundred Class I railroads in this country. As recently as 40 years ago, we had about 40. We're down to 4 major Class I railroads in this country, 2 in the east, 2 in the west, and they largely control and put a stranglehold on industry and commerce, to say nothing of passenger rail development in the United States. So I could talk all day about the question. What I will do is conclude by saying, I don't think there's too many people alive that is more in favor of passenger train expansion than myself. Having worked for Amtrak for 20 years, the rail industry for 27, and been involved in rail in various capacities for years prior to that, I honestly believe that it is the way of the future. It's what the rest of the world is forging ahead with. It offers a huge solution to the environmental crisis facing us, not just here, but globally. But I do believe we are up against the wall, and we are deceiving ourselves if we think that we are simply going to make nice with the Class I railroads and they are simply going to allow for a passenger train expansion. So I think what I'll do is just leave it at that, and I'm fascinated to hear what the other panelists have to say, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ron. A lot there, a lot more to say. There is. Okay, we're just going to move it along. And our next panelist, Mary Nickum, the Eco-Socialist Working Group Socialist Party.
Hello, I'm happy to be here. My interest in the rail goes back to my father, who was a section worker and laid track and did all that kind of stuff back in the late 20s, early 30s, and then worked as a freight house in the freight house for the New York Central. And then he retired from the railway and went off farming. And as I grew up with the idea of traveling on the train, and I have traveled on the train for many years, and I've been on Amtrak, and I just love it. It's my favorite way to travel. Anyway, a key concern for the Eco-Socialist Working Group right now is global warming and/or climate change. The question of the hour is, how does this affect labor? The rail workers. In 2020, 55 fatal work injuries occurred where the primary or secondary source of weather and atmospheric conditions. This was a 29.5% decline from 2019, 78 deaths, and the lowest count since 2015 at 52 deaths. Most of these deaths have weather and atmospheric conditions as the secondary source. Primary source refers to the object, substance, exposure, or bodily motion responsibility for a death. The secondary source refers to the object, substance, or person, if any, that generated the primary source or conditional source event. Some occupants pose more climate-related health risks for workers than others. Millions of U.S. workers are exposed to heat in their workplaces. Although illness from exposure to heat is preventable, every year thousands become sick from occupational heat exposure, and some cases are fatal. For example, outdoor workers and indoor workers who engage in heavy physical labor and are exposed to high temperatures are more likely to suffer from heat-related illnesses and death. Some research studies have found agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, and construction workers experience the highest rates of heat-related mortality. And I would put the rail workers, outdoor rail workers, as part of that construction worker group. Not only heat is dangerous to outdoor workers, cold can be too. Cold temperatures and increased wind speed, wind chill, cause heat to leave the body more quickly, putting workers at a risk of cold stress. Anyone working in the cold may be at risk, including workers in freezers, construction, outdoor agriculture, and forestry. Most national climate or employment policies do not address the impact of climate change on health and productivity in the workplace. Workers and employers need protection now and measures to manage risk to health, income, and output to exist, but often entail costs that may compound challenges, as in case of air conditioning, a costly and energy and emissions intensive response. Risks become increasingly less manageable and costly to deal with at higher levels of warming, as even 34.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming entails substantial increased heat and workplace impacts that should be a strong incentive for ambitious action to reduce emissions and limit warming. Outdoor workers have learned over many generations how to accommodate the weather in their daily working lives. Farmers have it down to an art. They need the clouds. They watch and read the clouds and other signs for plowing, planting, and harvesting. With experience, reading the signs of weather, clouds, sundogs, changes in wind direction, humidity, give the farmer much information. Even the overhead migration of flocks of birds are a sure sign of impending season and thus weather changes. Now it is different. Many of the signs are still there, but harder to read and much less dependable. The changes that used to signal the incoming of a thunderstorm now may bring damaging winds, tornadoes, and heavy rain. Rains have been measured in 4 to 6 inches in an hour. Tornadoes appear in areas such as northern Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. They're even happening in Great Britain and Northern Europe. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics provides a bleak projection if we don't take action. Without global mitigation, an increase in extreme heat is projected to have a large negative impact on the U.S. labor hours, especially for outdoor labor industries. In 2100, over 1.8 billion labor hours across the workforce are projected to be lost related to unsuitable working conditions, 95% confidence intervals of 1.2 to 2.4 billion. These lost hours would be totally costly, totaling over 170 billion in lost wages in 2100, 95% confidence intervals of 110 to 220 billion. The majority of the country is projected to experience decreases in labor hours resulting from extreme temperature effects. In 2100, parts of the Southwest and Florida are estimated to experience a decrease in hours worked at high-risk industries ranging from -5% to -7%. Although the impacts vary by region, only a limited number of countries are projected to experience increase in labor hours.
7 minutes is up, Mary. Could you wrap it up?
Sure. Climate change is the large part of the effect of emissions of carbon into the atmosphere by petroleum-based activities. Trains are particularly low-carbon ways to travel. Taking a train instead of a car for medium-length distances could cut your emissions by around 80%. Using a train instead of a domestic flight would reduce your emissions by about 86%. The largest source of transportation greenhouse gases were light-duty trucks, which include sport utility vehicles, pickup trucks, and minivans. So, according to the agencies, statistics, and other environmental organizations, we don't have time to watch. Wait and see is not an option.
Hey, thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. We're going to go move along until we get to the questions. But first, let's go to the next panelist, Eric Chester, a member of the Labor Working Group.
Yeah, I wanted to move on from what Mary said at the end. This question of climate change is an urgent question. It's one that requires immediate and drastic action. Contrary to Ron, I'm a radical. I think it requires radical changes. And I think that's an important context to keep in mind. Often when we are dealing with environmental questions, we're dealing with issues that impact negatively on parts of the workforce, oil and gas being the clearest example. Here we have the excellent example of where doing something to counter climate change will actually help the workforce, the railroad workforce. And it's something we should stress when we're talking about this. We need more railroads. We need to move people out of cars, out of trucks, out of short and medium flights. And we need it now and drastically. That's where I start from. Now, I think we should keep in mind, Ron's absolutely right, that the state owns the infrastructure in most countries, but it's more than that. In Western Europe, Japan, China, all those places have high-speed rail networks. And when I say high speed, I mean upwards of 125 miles an hour. And just to give you a sense, currently, one of the projects that's going on installed in California is LA to San Francisco. It takes 9.5 hours to go 350 miles. That's pathetic. That's pathetic. That won't do. That will not cut it. You will not shift people from cars or planes to trains that go that slow. Just won't do it. If we had high-speed rail, it would be 4 hours. We could cut it in half. Now, the only argument that I hear against it is expensive. Well, we better face it. If we're going to counter climate change, it's going to be an expensive project. If we do nothing, it'll be even more expensive. We'll be likely to survive. Those are our choices. They're not happy choices. That's what capitalism has confronted us with. Those are the choices we have. We can either spend significantly to counter climate change, or we can wait for the disaster to happen. It seems to me if we had one more point. I noticed after the Baltimore bridge collapse, Biden said this was a high priority. He was going to do whatever it takes to get that bridge working. Well, you know, that is unfortunately the way it works. You spend a lot of money to restore the status quo, but the status quo doesn't work. The status quo doesn't work. I mean, all those cars that go over that highway just add more pollution to the environment, more carbon into the atmosphere. It's a no-go. We need that same kind of urgency that Biden's talking about to redo the Baltimore Bridge. We need it for high-speed rail. If we had a 10-year project of, say, $150 billion a year, that's $1.5 trillion over 10 years. Sounds expensive. Let me tell you, the United States spends nearly $1 trillion on the military every year. This is small compared to that. We can waste $1 trillion, I mean, I'm putting it euphemistically, on the military. We can sure spend $150 billion a year on building high-speed rail. And that seems to me what we need to be talking about, that kind of urgency, because if we don't have that, we are really facing disaster. I mean, we can see it already beginning to happen. And it's going to happen worldwide. So I think that's what we need, that sense of urgency. If we can build high-speed rail, we could start from finishing that LA San Francisco project. How about Boston to Washington? That's 400 miles. It takes this so-called fast train. It takes 7 hours. Ain't going to cut it. We need high-speed rail. That would, 3 to 4 hours. It's all can be done. This is not, untested technology. They already have this in Western Europe. They've had it since the 70s and 80s. We can do it too in the United States, but it's going to take some real political will. It's going to take a social movement. And why should we, that is the working class people of the United States, pay for this? After all, it's the rich people who benefited from destroying the environment. Let them pay to counter the impact of what they did. We need to tax the rich to pay for projects like high-speed rail and, in fact, many other projects that are going to counter climate change. That's the kind of direction I think we need to have. And it would be lovely to see a coalition of railroad workers and environmentalists and leftists organizing now for a high-speed rail network in the United States.
Hey, Eric, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It is an urgent question. I'm going to go right to Wayne Turner. He's running for governor on the Green Party ticket in North Carolina, and he's with the North Carolina Greens. So take it away, Wayne. Can't hear you, Wayne. Mute, you're on mute.
Yeah, got it.
There we are, okay.
Thanks. I'm going to make a few brief remarks a little bit about the history of rail in the United States, especially passenger rail, with a few figures. Passenger rail in the United States actually dates back to the 1830s. This is about a decade after the first practical railway engine was demonstrated in England. Initially, rail did focus on freight. The people were expanding westward, and things needed to be carried out there, including the material to build more rail. And as a result, early passenger rail accommodations were pretty sparse. They consisted of wooden benches on cars that were open to the elements. The railroads themselves in their construction were rough affairs. There were no standards for rail beds. They were often uneven. But passenger accommodations did begin to improve as more track was laid, and the increase in passengers brought about some improvements in rail construction as well as passenger accommodations. Not too surprisingly, passenger accommodations quickly became distinguished by class membership. You had separate cars for people that were economically well-to-do, and you had more Spartan furnishings for the working class. And as one's financial resources decreased, they got worse and worse. The worst accommodations were referred to as immigrant cars, that's EMI grant, located in front of the better accommodations and closer to the hot cinder-filled exhaust of the engine. Railroads in the U.S. continued to develop technologically throughout the remainder of the 19th century. But along with the country, they also reflected social and economic conditions that were prevalent under capitalism. Marx was alive for much of this period. The railroads, as capitalist ventures, exhibited many characteristics of his theses on surplus labor, on capital, and commodity production. But they were also tightly bound with the narratives of slavery and labor organizing and the ongoing class struggle between labor and capital. Marx addressed the horrific work schedules of railway engineers and conductors in England. Sometimes they were jailed as responsible for fatal accidents caused by overwork. The ruthless railroad investor and magnate Jay Gould, when asked about the threat of strike to a railroad which he bought and subsequently bankrupted, in a foreshadowing of today's private equity investors, replied that he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. Shortly after Marx's death, the railroad strike of 1877, and later the 1894 Pullman strike organized by Eugene Debs, showed the lengths to which the government would go to preserve the power of capital when faced with labor rebellions. They would trot out the military to handle it. Railroads continued to be sites of class and race struggle well into the 20th century, but with the advent of World War I, Woodrow Wilson nationalized the railroads in the name of the war effort to move weapons, people, and material. From late 1917 to March of 1920, the railroads were administered by the U.S. Rail Administration. Unions, as Ron pointed out, wanted the rails to remain nationalized in accordance with the Plum Plan of 1918, but in 1920, they were given back to their original owners. By this point, the automobile and truck industry was beginning to make some inroads into freight and passenger transport. The railroad companies did try to regain their former profitability with more track and stock investment, but they did not fare well during the Great Depression. After World War II, they had lost much of their passenger traffic. They were relying on freight for survival. However, class-run railroads run on what is still the largest amount of track in the world. We have approximately 160,000 miles of track in the U.S., of which 3,400 miles are in North Carolina. Nationally, there are short line railroads in the Class 2 and Class 3 categories. Some of those carry passengers. However, since 1971, the nation's rail passenger traffic has been met by Amtrak, which is federally funded. Amtrak currently has record high passenger numbers, but over 70% of their runs are run on rail owned by Class 1 rail companies that are engaged in freight transport. So the rail industry, like many other things, with the advent of neoliberalism in the 1970s, began to consolidate. And nowadays, there are only 6 large Class 1 freight rail companies. Ron cited 4. I counted 6, but there may be a difference in the definition of Class 1 there, because I think Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 are classified by their income. And Amtrak is also considered a Class 1 company. It's just not freight. So currently, the Federal Railroad Administration has plans in place for a revitalization of passenger rail. Ron mentioned that the Biden administration had allocated around $66 billion for a network of regional passenger rail projects. And there is an active project to identify up to 69 different corridors for the construction of a passenger network. 2 of these are proposed to be newly built high-speed rail projects. That means trains that travel at least 155 miles per hour. And other upgrades to existing rail would allow trains to travel at 124 miles per hour. But those projects only cover 44 states. Colorado and California have their own rail projects planned, but these face financial barriers and political opposition. Investments are also planned in the population-dense Northeast corridor served by Amtrak, and also there are investments planned to open more north-south lines on the East Coast. However, the freight rail network, when accounting for regional rail as well as much longer lines covering many states, is much denser than the rail network that is currently rated or owned by Amtrak. Existing rail and its accompanying rights-of-way should be an important asset to a national passenger rail system, and they should be included in the FRA's plans. What remains to be seen is whether or not the federal government is able to muster the political will to bring the freight carriers to heel and insist on their contribution to a national rail network. So far, the government has not recognized the need to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. So we might think of questions among panelists to ask. We also want to ask Ron to respond to our 4 panelists and add additional comments if he likes. You can take it over here from here, Ron.
Okay, thanks, Bill. And thanks, Eric and Mary and Wayne. Just taking a few notes. I'll respond as quickly as I can. First of all, Wayne, you're right. There are 6 Class 1s now because Canadian Pacific gobbled up the Kansas City Southern. I've been using 4 lately because there's 4 major US-based Class 1s that largely control somewhere between 80 and 90% of the Class 1 freight that's moved. CP and CN, while they've become larger players in US freight movements in recent years, are still somewhat minor players, especially CP, limited trackage in North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, basically is the extent of CP. CN is a little bit larger reach all the way down to New Orleans. They gobbled up the old Illinois Central. But you're right, and we probably should use that because they are the 6 big Class 1 railroads, which together control 90% of the freight. And you're also right, Amtrak is considered a Class 1 railroad because it has revenues of over $1 billion. Of course, it's not a railroad per se in the traditional sense of the word, and it doesn't move freight. So it gets a little confusing with these various semantics of what a Class 1 railroad is. But thank you for putting that in. Another statistic that you cited, Wayne, was 160,000 miles of track. You might be right. I've been led to believe there's 140,000. Don't want to quibble with it. But the interesting thing about this, for everybody who's here today, we used to have 240,000 miles of track in this country. So we've lost at least 100,000 miles of it. And this is stuff you can't get back easily. There's a few sections that are bike paths and so forth, but most have been either plowed over or have Walmarts or highways or what have you on them. We're never going to get them back. So these corridors, we must simply say no anytime a Class 1 railroad or any railroad seeks to abandon any piece of track, because they're worth their weight in gold. As California and Texas are finding out, it is extremely difficult to build a new dedicated right-of-way. It's a political quagmire of condemning land, pissing off endless people to buy that property. It's extremely expensive. And so with the biggest network of conventional railroad right-of-way, we need to work and preserve what we have. And so with that, I will go over to Eric Chester's comments on high-speed rail. I don't mind high-speed rail, especially in places like Spain and Japan, where they've been developing it for decades, and it works really, really well. In this country, we are at least 50 years behind the times. In 1964, the Japanese developed the first high-speed railroad train. It's carried billions of people. They've had no fatalities. It's an amazing piece of infrastructure. We gotta crawl before we can walk. And like I say, the political pitfalls of building a high-speed rail network in this country are immense, and we won't have anything to show for it, as we can see in California. Texas is belly up right now, but California, they've been doing this now for over a decade. There's no end in sight. It's cost tens of billions of dollars. For that money, we could already have conventional trains running at 100 miles an hour between San Francisco and LA. And I know a lot of us on this call feel the same way. High-speed rail is great. One day, right now, we got the biggest rail network in the world. Let's get to business using that right away, which is incredibly underutilized. It has very few freight trains and very few passenger trains on it. And this network is waiting to be used. And I think we should get on with the business of using it. Last but not least, in response to Mary, for folks who don't realize the efficiencies of rail, there's endless things that make rail superior to other forms of transportation. First of all, it's the safest form of transportation known to humanity. Second of all, a double-track railroad that is properly dispatched and run and maintained can handle the traffic of a 4-lane interstate highway with about 10% of the land usage, no rubber tire detritus that is now filtering into our groundwater, our streams and rivers and so forth, and becoming a huge environmental problem. Railroads can be easily electrified with overhead catenary. That electricity can be generated by renewable resources, and literally reducing the carbon emissions of a railroad to zero. There's also this thing called regenerative braking I won't go into, where trains, when they slow and stop, can actually produce electricity, put that electricity back into the power grid. So for those who are doubting the efficiencies of rail and as a solution to the climate crisis, I just wanted to embellish what Mary had to say. There is no doubt in our minds that rail is the key to a sound environmental future. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, Ron, thank you. So open up the questions. Do anybody in the panelists, among panelists, have any questions to ask? Ask of Ron or a general?
I think I might have a couple to throw out there. I'd also point out that we might invite the people on the chat to put a question or two in as well for Ron, or anyone on the panel for that matter. Ron, I thought about several things associated with the issue of rail. And I noticed you quoted a statistic earlier from an article about the decline in Class 1 freight. And that article was, I believe, actually an article that was written by the Railroad Workers Union and appeared yesterday on Popular Resistance. One of the points in that article was that the Class 1 freight companies have double-tracked rights-of-way, but they've been tearing up some of their double track. This is reminiscent to me of a move that other industries have made, specifically private equity firms who buy up hospitals. They They then reduced the number of hospital beds to jack their rent per bed up. And I wondered if you know, about your opinion that maybe the tearing up of double track was a tactic for the Class 1 railroads. It would let them thwart passenger rail and at the same time maximize rail fees.
It's a complex issue, Wayne. There is, you know, some basic economics that railroads are taxed on their property. It's probably something that really should be reformed. We don't want to give railroads an incentive to rip up that second or third track because it's absurd. In the interest of efficiencies, lowering the operating ratio and returning the greatest return on investment to stockholders in the next quarter, railroads are, as we know, cutting maintenance, cutting inspection, cutting staff, increasing the length of trains. And if they deem that it makes sense, removing second tracks. We lost a lot of second tracks in the 80s and 90s. The Illinois Central through Illinois was double tracked, the Milwaukee Road to the Twin Cities from Chicago. All of these were reduced to single track with sidings. And given if you're only going to run 10 or 15 or even 20 freight trains a day down them, this might make sense. But we need to be running 50, 100, and maybe 200 movements. And if you check the Solutionary Rail website, solutionaryrail.com, you will see a model of double-tracked electrified railroads that could handle this volume of freight. In this day and age, we should never, ever single-track any piece of railroad. A double-track railroad is exponentially more efficient than a single-track railroad. It doesn't just double the amount of movements that you can make, but with proper high-speed crossovers that are what's called universal, where you can cross from one track to the other in either direction, a double-track railroad, even conventional in this day and age, can easily handle 100 freight trains a day. And we have one of those, just one that I'm aware of in this country. Well, there's a few, but the old Santa Fe main line from Chicago to LA Long Beach typically runs 80 to 100 trains a day. So it can be done, but you're not going to get that ability to move that volume of tonnage on a single track railroad. I just want to say one more thing on this question of single track. Hunter Harrison, who gave us precision scheduled railroading in all of its infamy, before he croaked, he became CEO at CSX, which underwent a huge meltdown because they closed a whole series of freight yards. They actually ripped the one out in Atlanta. The CEO said that we don't ever want this yard to be used again. So we rip it out so there's no temptation to ever put it back. Hunter Harrison, before he died, actually proposed single track in the old New York Central, which at one time was 4 main tracks. I think it was, he proposed this west of Buffalo, and it's the old territory I used to work on, Conrail. A pretty absurd idea, but this is the fanaticism that Wall Street is driven to. It's at the behest of the stockholders. If it's going to make you money in the few quarters in the near future to rip up that second track, then rip it up. And so we're in a perilous situation right now where Wall Street is using the railroads as this huge cash cow. And if that means shutting down hump yards, ripping up second tracks, abandoning and shutting down shops and other infrastructure, let's do it. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And that's the motto of Wall Street when it comes to the railroad industry.
I'm gonna insert a question here. I'll move on, Wayne. I'm sorry. We can go on a lot there, it seems like. One question Mary Patterson has: if government proves too slow to take this step on behalf of the public, do you envision a time or any conditions under which railroad workers would themselves take steps for public ownership? And add on to that, I'd like to hear more about the Plum Plan Why did you support that other than historically? And how does it work? What is the Plum Plan all about? So there's two big questions right there.
Well, I tell you what, Wayne referred to the Plum Plan, and in the interest of spreading the work around, if Wayne wants to speak about the Plum Plan, I'd be happy to just take the one part and let Wayne talk about the Plum Plan.
Well, I don't think I can provide lots of details about it. I mean, the Plum Plan was developed in 2018 by an engineer and railroad enthusiast who wanted to see a national rail network with passenger and freight, and he went to great lengths to develop a plan to do that with the existing infrastructure of the time, plus some new construction. I can't really talk about it much beyond that, other than to reiterate that for the unions, it would have been a very good deal. And they believed strongly that the rail should remain nationalized. Wilson had a golden opportunity to retain nationalized rail, and he gave it away. And even though rail continued to expand and continued to lay more track up into the 1960s and early 70s, after neoliberalism took over and they began to literally tear their infrastructure up, the Plum Plan became more and more remote. I'm sure there are people that can address that in better detail than I can. Over.
Well, I'll go ahead and pick up from Wayne. The reason Railroad Workers United supports a Plum Plan style idea is for the same reason that railroad workers voted overwhelmingly. The vote is phenomenal. It actually took place, the 16 unions at the time all polled their membership. The total combined vote was like 360,000 to like 1,500. It was overwhelming. And their experience of a few short months of public ownership convinced them that this was far better than the chaos of the existing privately owned railroad system. Wages increased, and they had some say in their conditions of employment. The Plum Plan, which was never realized, of course, was modeled to some extent on that brief experience and provided for a tripartite system of governance. And so you would have an equal number of representatives of the railroad workers organizations. So you would have 8 railroad worker representatives, let's say. You would have 8 professional railroad managers, and you would have 8 government appointees to protect, quote unquote, the public interest. And you can imagine today they would be from, let's say, the disabled community, environmental interests, passenger train interests, trackside communities, and so forth. And that this governing board would actually make decisions henceforth. Most railroad workers in any country, 100 years ago or today, if this is explained to them, we believe would be incredibly supportive, because the idea that we are going to actually have some say in the operation of the railroad is incredibly attractive, because every day we go to work, we watch the insanity and the nonsense and the lack of professionalism that goes into the decision-making process and how these railroads are run. I used to call it railroading by numbers. I'd go to work, I'd report for duty in Chicago, and it's like, what is the crisis of the day? Well, we got to pull this crew off of here, and then we got to van these guys to, Elkhart. And then meantime, we're literally vanning guys back from Elkhart. We don't have enough engines. It's just an insane way of running a railroad. Nothing is scheduled. And so I think railroaders would be extremely happy to support public ownership of the railroad. We're at the end of our rope. And like I say, we didn't take this decision lightly. It took 10 years for us to finally feel that we could come out in support of public ownership and not be ridiculed, lambasted, and so forth. Railroaders on the Class 1 railroads are sick to death of the Wall Street control of the rail industry. They're looking for answers. Whether or not they will glom onto this, we will soon discover. We are putting a full-time organizer in the field starting on Monday, and we fully expect that thousands of railroaders will be introduced to the concept, and we hope if we can get even half the support that railroaders gave to the Plum Plan in 1919, we will be elated, and we think this movement can take off. We would win the rest of the support of the labor movement at that point, and then hopefully many, many organizations in the environmental movement and so forth, and we would actually have a nationwide movement on our hands like we haven't seen for 100 years.
Any other questions of the panelists? Okay.
I could ask some more questions, but I wanted to respond to a comment that Thomas White made in the chat, and this is something that I've thought about many times in regards to the concept of workers' cooperatives. So, for example, we were considering that we in North Carolina, we pushed for the state to take over the energy grid and relieve our monopoly power of control of it. And Thomas brings up the issue of the operation must be managed in a professional manner the moment no entity in the U.S. is qualified to do. But I submit that we have in these rail companies, these class 1 companies, and in the energy sector and many other sectors that frankly could benefit from nationalization. That is the workers that are qualified to do this. Upper management is of little use to us, and I suspect that given the opportunity, the railroad workers and the unions could respond quite adequately to the issue of developing management plans and running the railroads in a professional manner. Just an observation. Over.
Can I respond to Ron? Bill?
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah. Well, first, let me point out that right now, at this very time, in Denmark, they're building a high-speed railroad from Copenhagen to Aarhus, the 2 largest cities in Denmark. And they're using new track. They're not running it on the old track because that won't work. The old track is too curvy. It costs money, no doubt. It costs money, but it can be done. And in fact, is currently being done, not just in the past, but is currently being done. This crawl before you walk. I mean, I never really believed it, but in particular, when we're confronted with the immediate disaster of climate change, that's not really going to cut it. Sorry, it's not. We don't have 40, 50 years to learn what actually Western Europe has already done 50 years ago, so it's already been learned, but whatever. We face a crisis. We face a crisis. And from what Ron is saying, and Wayne as well, to double track, we're going to have to lay new track. We're going to have to lay new track over tracks that are too curvy to take high speed. To me, that is totally inefficient. Bite the bullet. Decide you're going to do what they already did in Western Europe and China and Japan, and actually build new high-speed rail. It can be done. It has been done. It's actually a proven technology. Only in that way are we going to even begin to move people out of cars. That's not the end, because you're going to have to make those trains affordable, which means they're going to have to be heavily subsidized. You're going to have to ban short-term and medium-term flights. I mean, we're talking about drastic changes. If we don't do drastic changes, frankly, we're through. We can, the human species will destroy itself. It's well along on the way already. We have to start thinking in a different set of terms. Not how do we tweak the existing system, because it's failed. How do we radically change it? And one step towards that is to start building high-speed rail network.
I agree with Eric all the way. I think that our time is done for waiting. We cannot wait any longer. We have to get at it, and we have to be right at it, and we have to be strong and make it work. And there's, like you said, the technology is out there. They've got high-speed trains all over the place in China, Japan, and Europe. And why can't we have it here? Instead, we're trying to figure out how to take tracks up and lay tracks down and all this kind of stuff. Let's do it, and let's make some decisions here. The climate is not waiting. It's on its way out.
Yeah.
So if I could just respond without engaging in any kind of rhetorical argument, I'll just address a few of those points. On the question of double tracking, the railroad industry actually owns the corridor. So the corridor is there. Double tracking a railroad doesn't require any condemnation of land, engaging in huge political fights and legal battles, because the railroad generally owns at least 50 feet on either side of its right of way. So, and many railroads were double tracked and was ripped up. So putting that second track back, like the subdivision that I worked for many years, the Nevada sub here from Reno to Winnemucca, much of it was double tracked. The culverts are there, the bridges are there, the roadbed is there. It's just a question of putting the track back. So that's very, very cheap, relatively speaking. And in cases where there wasn't a second track, there is definitely often a service roadway and other land that is, you know, part of the railroad properties. So that would be very easy to double and even triple track a lot of railroads in the country. On the question of high speed specifically, with all due respects to Eric and Mary, what you haven't addressed is the question of freight. And freight movements account for a huge amount of carbon emissions. So high-speed rail all over the world is largely geared towards dedicated right-of-way for passenger movements. And what we're talking about here in a lot of cases, even though this webinar is geared toward passenger, we see them as part and parcel with the same. A very efficient railroad can move 200 movements easily in a 24-hour period of both freight and passenger at what we call higher speed rail, which means about 100, 110 miles an hour on conventional existing right-of-ways. And that's fast enough. And we can do it in a lot shorter period without the political quagmire and the expense of a dedicated 200, 250 mile an hour glitzy passenger only railroad. So I'll rest my case for now, but I would love to engage you guys in a conversation further on this off the webinar.
Any other questions? Anybody in the audience a question? Great discussion here. Yeah,
I
Wayne.
can probably certainly engage Ron on a couple of things. I want to go back actually to the question that we were just discussing, in a sense of are we better to, you know, try for our upper targets of 124 or 155 miles per hour, or make do with what we have more efficiently. And I was wondering, whether there were any numbers that were showing differences in time and cost between existing technology on existing rail versus the return on investment in time savings and energy efficiency, and trying to achieve at least the lower bounds of high-speed rail speeds. We have two speeds here, and to look at 124 miles an hour, 155 miles an hour, and now 110 miles an hour. My personal experience, I guess, is that the difference in 10 miles an hour, at least on highways, is insignificant in terms of time, but highways have many built-in delays and so forth. Still, we were talking about the corridor in California, and a distance of 350 miles was brought up. And at 100 miles an hour, that's 3.5 hours. 110 miles an hour, it's a little bit less than that. If it takes 8 or 9 hours to do that, there must be something in the way of the trains being able to maintain speed. I mean, if we had a train that ran at 110 miles an hour between those two locations, what stops it from making that trip in 3.5 hours?
Currently, it's actually running a route that's along the coast. It's very slow. And I doubt very much if you can sort of tweak it to 100 miles an hour. Ron's saying that, but I doubt it. I don't believe it. What they're talking about in California is an entirely different route. It's not along the coast. It goes through the valley. It'll be shorter. It'll be quicker. You know, it's yeah, it does puzzle me. I mean, because what I'm arguing is not hypothetical. I can point to Western Europe where they have this system already. And I don't understand why that couldn't be integrated into a freight system as well. Because passenger travel trains generally don't run all night. You can run freight all night. What I'm saying is suggesting it's actually in existence, right? And it runs, you know, it drastically cuts rail time. That's a fact. That's not a hypothetical. That's a fact. And the only counter arguments made so far is it's expensive, which is certainly true. All I can say is it's going to be expensive to counter climate change. You're kidding yourself otherwise. I don't believe that you can take the current San Francisco to LA train route and make it anywhere near 4 hours. I don't think that's possible.
And I just have to
curvy
clarify.
System. It's not direct. It wasn't designed for that purpose. That's why it takes 9.5 hours. And I don't believe it. So it'd be far better. After all, they've already built part of it already. Finish it. Finish the construction. Yes, it will cost some money, but when it gets done, you will actually have a train route that could compete with a flight from SFO to LAX.
So just to clarify, when I said that conventional rail can be easily increased to 100 miles an hour, I don't mean every single route. The coast route from San Francisco to LA was built, I think, in the 1870s. It's very archaic and antiquated, curvy and hilly. That doesn't qualify. So if there's any confusion that I actually was using that as an example, every railroad is different. The railroad that I'm familiar with is also very difficult. It goes over Donner Pass. It was built by the Chinese in the 1860s. The speed limits are about 30 miles an hour. That cannot be increased because of its curvature. However, there's a specific locations in the country that are mountainous and difficult terrain. This is a big country and lots and lots and lots of main lines that are now limited to 60 or 70 for freight and 79 for passenger. There was a time, not too in the distant past, that these railroads actually ran at 100 and 110 miles an hour. The equipment Amtrak uses, its locomotives and cars, are rated for 110 miles an hour. And many of these railroads across Nebraska and Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, I could go on, are arrow straight in many places and easily can be run with limited financial input at 110 miles an hour. I'm not talking about the coastline. I'm not talking about Donner Pass. I'm not talking about crossings of the Rockies. I'm talking about a sizable percentage of mainline railroading in this country can be increased in speed But it's not just about speed, folks. It's about volume. You're not going to be moving freight trains once again down dedicated high-speed rail lines. And so we need to do something. And I think we all can agree with this, whether we're in favor of the high speed, do it now or not. We can all agree that we want to move more freight off the interstate highways, out of the nation's waterways, and definitely out of the skies, and put it on rail. And that's going to entail electrification and double tracking of our existing infrastructure. And in doing that, passenger rail will simply benefit immensely. It will come along as a sort of partner in that venture by default, because now with double track railroads that are electrified, moving passenger trains is no longer interfering with the movement of freight. And if anybody wants to take a train ride from Chicago to LA and watch how the passenger train zigzags in and out of all those container trains coming out of LA Long Beach, you will get a sense of how freight and passenger trains can commingle.
Okay. If there's no other questions, I'm not sure. Any more questions do people have, a panel or in our audience? Yeah, Nathan had a question about the capital budget for public freight rail company. Freight charges, bonds, dedicated taxes from state governments, and public subsidies. How many of these should be public company use, public commuter lines, use all four, but with fare box revenue instead of freight charges? More of a very technical question.
Wrap it up.
Well, we have a question that's not answered here.
Yeah, Nathan had a question.
Charges bonds.
Let me
I think it'd be a good time to wrap it up. Ooh,
The
let's see.
yeah, this.
I mean, I guess I could take a stab at answering Nathan's question.
Okay, and then,
I guess when I look at your question, I think of it in the sense of what are the possibilities that are open to us for making better use of existing rail in this country. I would very much like to see a workers' cooperative or a publicly owned company that was competing with the class ones, which would be very hard to get at. But there are large portions of the rail network in this country that are considered class 2 and class 3 rail that cover a lot of miles. And they don't all go between major cities, but they do offer the possibility that a publicly owned company or a workers' cooperative might be able to make use of that part of that network to run regional rail services. At least that's what I see when I look at the maps. I would very much think that there are probably regional rail companies out there that sort of teeter on the verge of profitability that could easily be converted to a workers' cooperative, or rather than have a company go out of business and its tracks be unused, the state or maybe a regional government consortium could take that company and make sure that it stayed solvent and provided jobs and so forth and so on. Such a company, states subsidize companies to come into their states and their regions all the time, just in order to get a few jobs. Sometimes this costs them many millions of dollars. So I would think that a state or a consortium of states that has access to regional rail would see some profitability to this. And they would act to fund such a company, if that answers your question, at least regionally.
Let's wrap it up here with that question, Ron, as best you can.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I'm busy trying to answer questions in the chat, and I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I'll be happy to answer it if you could rephrase it.
Well, what was asked was about of all the sources of income that were available to the Class 1 companies, including government subsidies and their own private fees. How much of those sources of income would or should be available to a publicly owned rail company? And my partial answer was any government subsidy that's available to the Class 1s ought to be available to a public company.
Yeah, I mean, getting into the weeds on public ownership, it's very hypothetical, whether or not this will succeed and exactly what form it will take. Would public ownership entail owning the infrastructure? Like in some countries, would it entail owning the infrastructure and the actual trains, as is the case in other countries? It's impossible to speculate. But there's this idea of like the steel interstate, the interstate highway, if you will, not to insult any of the socialists here, but was the biggest socialist project in the history of the world. $2 trillion was spent to build the interstate highway system in this country. And this is an oblique way of answering the question, Wayne, but imagine if the US government today were to undertake a steel interstate equivalent and spend $2 trillion, which in this day and age would probably be like $4 trillion, to rehabilitate the nation's railroads, double, triple, quadruple track them, electrify them, et cetera, we would have one hell of a railroad system. But unfortunately, we went in a different direction and ended up subsidizing highways, cars, and trucks. But you're right, any subsidy that the rail industry gets today, and I would speculate that any subsidy that the highway system gets today should be accessible and available to a publicly run railroad system.
Okay, very good. Thank you all for participating, and in the audience, thank you all for listening in and great questions. Ron, thank you again for your great knowledge and your help here. We appreciate it very much. We'll see you again. Good luck. We'll look for the public ownership campaign and keep people informed here in the SP. And good luck with your convention and with that campaign. So thank you very much. Solidarity to RWU and everyone else out there.
Good night.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.